The gun went off before Wilhelmina Easton even saw the man raise it. The shot cracked through the dry afternoon air like a whip snapping across the face of the earth, and every person in the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas froze as though the sound had turned them all to stone. Wilhelmina did not freeze. She had traveled 800 miles on a rattling railroad car with nothing but 2 carpet bags, and the stubborn belief that her life could be something other than what it had been in Philadelphia. And she had not come all this way to die in the dirt of a frontier town that smelled of horse sweat and sawdust. She threw herself sideways behind a water trough, her skirts catching on the warped wood, her heart slamming against her ribs with a ferocity that felt almost personal, as though her own body was outraged at the danger. The second shot hit the trough, and she felt the vibration of it travel up through her gloved palms. From across the street came a voice she had heard for the first time only 40 minutes ago, low and certain, the kind of voice a man had when he was so accustomed to being in control that even crisis could not strip it from him entirely. "Dalloway, put that weapon down before you make the worst decision of an already poorly lived life." Ezekiel Garrison. The rancher who had hired her. Or rather, the rancher who had received her letter 3 months ago when she had answered a notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer, seeking an educated woman to serve as a schoolteacher in the frontier settlement of Caldwell. She had not expected him to be the one who met her at the station. She had not expected him to be 32 years old and broad-shouldered with dark eyes that looked at her as though he were trying to read every word she had ever written, and several she had not. She had not expected the first hour of her new life to end with someone shooting at him from the door of the Silver Creek Saloon, and she had absolutely not expected herself to feel the cold grip of terror that had nothing to do with the bullets, and everything to do with the possibility that this infuriatingly steady man might take one in the chest before she had ever properly learned his name. The man called Dalloway was shouting something about land, about betrayal, about a hidden agreement that had been broken. His voice was ragged and full of the special desperation of a man who believed he had nothing left to lose. Wilhelmina pressed her back against the trough and made herself breathe slowly. She had learned to breathe slowly when her father had been taken by cholera in 1882, when the debts had come due, and she had sold every piece of furniture her mother owned to pay them, when the man she thought she would marry had looked at her reduced circumstances and found himself suddenly and conveniently in love with a banker's daughter. Slow breathing was what she did instead of breaking apart. She peered around the edge of the trough. Ezekiel Garrison was standing in the open street with the absolute stillness of someone who had made a deliberate choice to stand there, his arms slightly away from his sides, his hat pushed back on his head so the afternoon sun caught the hard planes of his face. He was not reaching for the revolver at his hip. He was simply standing there, talking to a desperate man with a gun, as if the only currency he trusted was the truth spoken plainly. That was the moment. That specific, inexplicable moment in the first hour of her new life, when Wilhelmina Easton understood that she had arrived somewhere that would cost her more than she had budgeted for, and give her more than she had dreamed. She simply had no idea yet how either of those things would prove to be exactly right. 3 months earlier, Wilhelmina had been sitting at a kitchen table in a boarding house on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, going through the help-wanted notices in the newspaper with the methodical attention of a woman who had learned that desperation was only useful when it was disciplined. She was 26 years old. She had a teaching certificate, a good hand for mathematics, and a mother who had recently remarried and moved to Connecticut, leaving Wilhelmina with the boarding house rent and no particular reason to stay. The notice had been small and unadorned, the way honest notices always were. It read, "Wanted educated woman of steady character for position of schoolteacher, Caldwell, Kansas. Settlement growing rapidly. Accommodation and fair wages provided. Inquire Garrison Land Company, care of E. Garrison." She had written the letter that same evening. She was not impulsive by nature. She was, as her former almost fiancé had once said with a certain condescension that she had only recognized in retrospect, relentlessly practical. But there was a difference between practicality and the particular stillness of a life gone flat. And by the winter of 1883, Wilhelmina Easton's life had gone so flat that she could hear the emptiness of it echoing when she moved through a room. The reply had come 6 weeks later, written in a hand that was blunt and direct without being unkind. Garrison confirmed the position, outlined the terms, specified a start date in April, and included a bank draft for the train fare with a note that said simply, "The frontier will test every assumption you have carried here from the East. Prepare accordingly." She had found that note both presumptuous and oddly galvanizing. She had packed her 2 carpet bags, kissed her mother at the train station in Hartford during a brief stopover, and set her jaw for 800 miles. The train to Caldwell took 2 days and required 2 connections, and by the time Wilhelmina stepped off the platform into the raw April air of south-central Kansas, she was tired in the particular way that traveled tiredness produced, which was somehow both physical and philosophical. The land stretched out in every direction with a vastness that she had not been prepared for despite all her preparations. Philadelphia had horizons that were made of buildings and church steeples. Here the horizon was simply sky, enormous and pale, and indifferent in a way that made her feel simultaneously very small and very free. Ezekiel Garrison had been leaning against a post near the station with his arms crossed and his hat low, and when she descended the platform steps with her 2 bags and the specific expression of a woman who would not be intimidated by an unreasonable amount of open space, he had straightened up and crossed the dirt street with a long, unhurried stride that covered the distance quickly despite appearing in no particular hurry. "Miss Easton," he said, and it was not a question. "Mr. Garrison," she replied, and extended her gloved hand in the businesslike manner she had decided upon in advance, because she was here for a position, not for any of the things that a woman traveling west alone was sometimes assumed to be looking for. He shook her hand with a firm, brief grip. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the bright Kansas sun, and they assessed her with a directness that she found unsettling and strangely respectful at the same time, as though he were seeing her rather than what he expected her to be. "You'll want to get your bearings before I show you around the settlement," he said. "There's a decent boarding house run by a woman named Clara Hendricks. She'll have a room ready for you." "That's very considerate, Mr. Garrison. It's practical," he said. "A teacher who collapses from exhaustion on her first day is no use to anyone." She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to humor she had heard in a long while that did not feel like it was at someone's expense. "By that reasoning," she said, "perhaps we could begin our arrangements in some order that does not require me to collapse as a precondition." He looked at her for a moment with something shifting in those dark eyes. Then he picked up her heavier bag and said, "This way." They were halfway down the main street, which was called Garrison Avenue, a fact she noted without comment, when the doors of the Silver Creek Saloon burst open, and a man came staggering out with a gun in his hand, and a face full of the kind of rage that had been building for a very long time behind a door that had finally given way. His name, as she would later learn, was Robert Dalloway, and his history with Ezekiel Garrison was a complicated tangle of land disputes, broken promises made by a previous business partner of Ezekiel's named Caleb Marsh, and the particular bitterness of a man who had been cheated but was pointing his fury at the wrong person. Caleb Marsh had sold Dalloway water rights that Marsh did not legitimately own, collected the money, and vanished from Caldwell 6 months prior, leaving Ezekiel to weather the fallout of a fraud he had not committed. None of this was available to Wilhelmina in the 40 minutes she had been in Kansas. What was available to her was the sound of gunshots and the sight of a composed, watchful man choosing to stand in an open street and speak to someone who was trying to shoot him. The standoff lasted 14 tense minutes that felt to Wilhelmina like a much larger portion of her life. Ezekiel's voice remained level throughout. He acknowledged Dalloway's anger as legitimate. He named Marsh as the actual source of the betrayal. He made a specific, concrete offer. If Dalloway would put the gun down, Ezekiel would purchase the disputed water rights at fair value out of his own funds, even though the fraud had not been his to make right. "That's Marsh's debt," Dalloway shouted, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief. "It is," Ezekiel said. "But Marsh is gone and you're still here, and so am I. And between the two of us maybe we can come to an arrangement that keeps your cattle watered and keeps this from being the worst day of both our lives." The gun came down slowly, in increments, as though Dalloway's arm was making a decision that his brain had not yet fully endorsed. Then he sat down in the street and put his face in his hands, and the sound that came out of him was the particular ragged exhalation of a man surrendering to the exhaustion of being furious for too long. The town's deputy, a young man named Harlan Briggs who had clearly been frozen behind the mercantile for the duration, came forward to take custody of the situation. Ezekiel spoke briefly with Briggs, then crossed the street to where Wilhelmina was standing, because she had come out from behind the water trough when the gun went down. He looked at her for a moment. There was a faint shadow of something in his expression, not quite apology, not quite assessment, something more like concern that had been carefully trimmed to its most functional shape. "Welcome to Caldwell," he said. "Is it often like this?" she asked. "No," he said. "Usually it's harder." She stared at him. Then helplessly she laughed, and he blinked as though the sound surprised him, and for one unguarded moment something warmer than concern moved through those dark eyes. "Let's get you to Clara Hendricks," he said. Clara Hendricks was a woman of 48 who had come to Kansas with her husband in 1875, buried him in 1879 from a fever, and decided that leaving was no longer worth the effort because she had put too much of herself into the Kansas soil to abandon it. She ran her boarding house with the efficient warmth of someone who had learned to care for people as an act of survival rather than sentiment, and she had hot food on the table and a clean room waiting for Wilhelmina with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who considered logistics a form of love. "Ezekiel wired me that you were coming," Clara said, setting a plate of beans and cornbread in front of Wilhelmina. "He told me to make sure you had everything you needed. He seems very practical," Wilhelmina said. Clara gave her a look that held more information than her words. "That man," she said, "has kept half this settlement running on nothing but practicality and the sheer stubbornness of a man who refuses to let things fail. But practical is just the layer he shows people until he decides whether they're worth showing the rest." Wilhelmina thought about that as she ate. She was too tired to think very deeply, but she filed it away in the methodical internal library, where she kept things that seemed important before she had the language for them. The school was a single room at the north end of Garrison Avenue, built from the same rough timber as every other building in Caldwell, with 8 mismatched desks and a blackboard that had been hauled in on a wagon from Wichita. Ezekiel showed it to her the following morning in the thin light of an April day that could not decide whether it wanted to be warm or cold. He stood in the doorway while she walked the perimeter of the room, running her hand along the desks, looking at the blackboard, checking the stove in the corner. "How many students?" she asked. 14 at present, ages 6 to 15. Some will only come when they're not needed on their family's homestead, which will vary by season. How much have they been taught? Variable. Some can read, some cannot. Most can count well enough to be cheated and know it. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that same steady attention, leaning against the doorframe with his arms loosely crossed, and in the morning light she could see that there were small lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of squinting into a western sun. He would have been considered handsome in Philadelphia if any of the men in Philadelphia had carried themselves with this quality of still self-possession that Ezekiel Garrison seemed to have been born with. "I'll need more chalk," she said, And primers if you can get them. I'll have them from Wichita within the fortnight. Paper. Some decent paper for the older students. Done. Coffee, she said, because the stove in the corner was the first stove she would have had access to in 3 months that was not shared with 8 other boarders, and the idea of coffee in her own space before students arrived struck her as possibly the most civilized prospect she had encountered in recent memory. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. Coffee, he said, as if adding it to a mental list that was taking on unexpected line items. Done. She turned back to the room and thought, this is a start. She began classes the following Monday. The first day she had 11 students, 3 of whom were initially suspicious of her in the way frontier children were suspicious of anyone new, which was to say they watched her with flat, patient eyes and withheld any signal of acceptance until they had gathered sufficient evidence. By Thursday she had all 14, including a girl named Macy Thorne who was 12 and had been reading on her own for 4 years and was hungry for someone to match her pace, and a boy named Tom Rourke who was 9 and had never been to school before but sat with his hands flat on the desk, as though the act of sitting still and listening was itself a kind of treasure he intended to protect. Wilhelmina loved them with a completeness that surprised her. She had thought she might find teaching on the frontier harder and less rewarding than teaching in Philadelphia, where she had worked briefly at a private girls' school before the position became a casualty of the school's financial troubles. But there was something about these children, their earnestness and their particular combination of toughness and openness, that made the work feel vital in a way that no amount of polish could replicate. Ezekiel checked in on the school every Friday afternoon. He was on the school board, which consisted of himself, Clara Hendricks, and a farmer named Obadiah Crane, who rarely appeared in person, but was relied upon to sign documents when required. The Friday visits were brief and businesslike. He would stand in the doorway after the students had gone home and ask how things were progressing, and Wilhelmina would give him a succinct and accurate report, and he would nod and sometimes ask a specific question about a particular student whose family he knew, and then he would leave. This went on for 3 weeks before either of them acknowledged that the conversations were lasting longer than the reports required. It was the 4th Friday when she was still at the blackboard erasing the day's work, and he had been standing in the doorway for 11 minutes by her careful count, ostensibly reviewing a request for supplies she had prepared, but the list was 4 items long and he had been looking at it for considerably longer than 4 items warranted. "You went to university," he said, not looking up from the list. "Briefly." 2 years at the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania before my father's illness required me to stop. She kept erasing, keeping her voice even. "I completed my teaching certificate independently afterward." "You wanted to be a doctor." It was not the question she had expected, which was why it landed with the particular accuracy of something aimed well. "I wanted to understand how things worked," she said. "Medicine seemed the most thorough way to learn. Teaching turned out to be nearly as good." He looked up then, and she was facing the blackboard, so she did not see the expression that crossed his face, but she heard something change in the quality of the silence behind her. "Why did you come here?" he asked. "Not the practical reasons." "The real one," she turned. He was looking at her with the same directness she had learned to expect from him, but with something additional in it, a quality of genuine wanting to know that was different from the assessment of earlier weeks. "Because flat is worse than hard," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes," he said simply, as though she had confirmed something he already believed. "It is." He left shortly after, but she stood in the quiet schoolroom for a long time with the chalk dust on her fingers, and the strange warm weight of being properly understood settling over her like a shawl around her shoulders. May arrived, and the Kansas sky performed its full repertoire of violence and beauty in rapid alternation. There were 3 days of rain that turned the street to mud so deep that her boots were ruined in the first hour of the first morning, and she taught class in her one pair of indoor shoes and refused to mention it. There was a day of wind so fierce that it pulled the schoolhouse door off one of its hinges, and she held it closed from the inside with both hands until Ezekiel appeared, inexplicably, with a hammer and 2 hinges, and had the door rehung in 20 minutes while she kept the children at their lessons as though nothing unusual were happening. "How did you know?" she asked when the last student had gone. "Tom Rourke's mother mentioned it when I rode past her place this morning. He was putting his tools back in the canvas sack he had brought. You just happen to have replacement hinges. I keep a supply of basic hardware. Frontier buildings are held together primarily by optimism and the annual refusal of things to get worse." She laughed again, and he looked at her again in that way he had, the way that made her feel as though laughter were something he found unexpectedly necessary, like water in a dry month. He stayed for dinner that evening, not at her invitation but at Clara Hendricks's, who appeared to operate on the understanding that a person doing useful work in the late afternoon was by natural right entitled to a meal. It was the first time Wilhelmina had sat at a table with Ezekiel Garrison without the explicit frame of business between them, and the experience was disorienting in precisely the degree she had expected and double that. He talked about the settlement. He had come to Caldwell 6 years ago with a land grant and enough capital to start a modest cattle operation, and what had grown up around the Garrison Land Company over those years had been something he had not entirely intended and was not entirely comfortable claiming credit for. He had built a well when water became scarce. He had extended credit to 3 homesteading families during the drought of 1880 and never collected. He had funded the schoolroom out of his own pocket when the proposed county funds evaporated. "Why?" Wilhelmina asked. "Because a place worth living in doesn't happen by accident," he said. "Someone has to decide to make it one." Clara refilled his coffee cup with the expression of someone who had heard this before and had never stopped being impressed by it. Wilhelmina looked at her hands around her own cup and thought about the particular quality of loneliness that she had carried all the way from Philadelphia without naming it, and how, in the specific warmth of this kitchen in this rough border town in the spring of 1883, it was beginning to feel lighter. Not gone, but lighter. June was when things began to shift in ways that could not be attributed to practicality. It started with the incident at the river crossing. A family named Mackey was attempting to move a wagon across the Chicaskia River ford 5 miles south of town, and the river was running higher than expected from late spring rains, and the wagon went sideways in the current with 2 of the Mackey children on board. Wilhelmina happened to be there because she had ridden out with Clara that afternoon to deliver a package to the Mackey homestead, and she did not stop to think but simply went into the water, because she had grown up near the Schuylkill River and could swim, which was apparently not a skill that had been considered when the crisis was unfolding. She got both children to the bank. She was up to her shoulders in cold river water by the time she did it, and her dress was soaked through, and her hair was entirely undone from its pins, and she was shaking with cold when she climbed out on the far bank with a 6-year-old boy held firmly against her side. Ezekiel arrived 12 minutes later because someone had ridden for him, and the first thing he did when he came down the bank was put his coat over her shoulders with a speed and steadiness that suggested this was simply the correct action to take. And then he counted the children, and then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was not the directness or the assessment or even the warmth she had begun to identify in his quieter moments. It was something rawer than any of those things, something that looked almost like fear but in the past tense, as though he had felt it and was now looking at its absence with shaky relief. "You could have drowned," he said. "I did not drown," she said through chattering teeth. "You could have." "Mr. Garrison, 2 children are dry and breathing, and their mother has just embraced them with a force that could unhinge a door. I am cold but entirely functional. Perhaps we might focus on the outcomes rather than the alternatives." He looked at her for a long moment with his coat heavy and warm on her shoulders and the river running behind them and the Mackey family tangled in their reunion on the bank. Then he said, in a voice that had lost all its careful control, "Wilhelmina." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it the way she would have felt a hand on her arm, gently stopping her from walking in front of something. "Yes," she said. He seemed to collect himself. The control came back, but it sat differently now, like a coat over a shape it had not been cut for. "There's a dry blanket on my horse," he said. "Come and change out of the wet." The summer was relentless in the way of Kansas summers, with heat that came down from the sky and rose up from the baked earth simultaneously, so that a person existed inside the heat rather than beside it. The schoolroom let out in mid-July for 6 weeks, and Wilhelmina, who had not considered what she would do with 6 weeks of unstructured time in a place that offered limited options, found herself being absorbed by the life of the settlement in ways that surprised and thoroughly occupied her. She helped Clara with the boarding house accounts, discovering a serious error in the ledger that had been costing Clara money for 2 years. She organized a small lending library out of the books she had brought with her, and the volumes that Clara had accumulated, and several donations from Ezekiel's own shelves, a collection she had not expected, and that told her things about him that his measured conversation had not. He owned Middlemark and 2 volumes of natural history, and a battered copy of Leaves of Grass that had clearly been read many times. She assisted the settlement's doctor, a capable but overwhelmed man named Silas Rowe, during 3 separate emergencies that summer, and Dr. Rowe, who had an eye for useful people and no energy to waste on social conventions, told her within a week that she had good hands and better instincts, and that if she ever wanted to formally pursue the medicine she had set aside, he would back her application personally. She stored that possibility in the same careful library as everything else, and went home to Clara Hendricks's kitchen table, and thought about how a life could expand in unexpected directions, when it was no longer being constricted by the need to simply survive. Ezekiel began appearing in ways that were increasingly difficult to categorize as coincidental. He was at the river on the first evening she decided to walk there for the cooling breeze off the water, sitting on a flat rock and whittling something that turned out to be a toy horse for young Tom Rourke, who had mentioned wanting one. He was at Dr. Rowe's on a Tuesday morning when she stopped in to return a medical text she had borrowed, checking on a ranch hand who had taken a fall. He appeared at the lending library's informal first gathering, which she had organized somewhat nervously, and which ended up having an attendance of 9, and contributed to a discussion of Middlemark with observations that were sharp and quietly passionate, and which she found far more interesting than any literary discussion she had attended in Philadelphia, where the point had often been to perform rather than to think. They rode out together for the first time on a Saturday in late July, purely by circumstance. She needed to deliver school enrollment forms to 2 families on the eastern edge of the settlement territory, and he was riding in that direction on ranch business. And Clara Hendricks suggested, with the transparent innocence of a woman who had seen something that 2 people were still pretending not to notice, that they might as well go together and save the bother of 2 separate trips. The ride took most of the morning. They rode side by side across the wide grass country with the sky enormous overhead and the distant line of the hills a soft smudge to the west, and the conversation began in its usual businesslike register, and then, somewhere around the 3rd mile, stopped being businesslike entirely. He told her about his family, a mother who had died when he was 17 and who had been, by his description, a woman of tremendous inner life who had never been given the space to express it. A father who had been a good man in the practical sense of the word, and an absent one in every other sense. A younger sister named Ruth, who lived in Missouri with her husband and 3 children and wrote him letters that were full of her life and good humor and a gentle, steady campaign to get him to visit. "And why haven't you visited?" Wilhelmina asked. "Because I've been building something, and leaving in the middle of building something is—" He paused, looking at the horizon. Is what? It's the same as telling yourself the thing isn't really worth finishing, he said. She turned that over in her mind. Or it might be telling yourself that the thing you're building is more important than everything else, she said, which is a different kind of problem. He glanced at her sidelong with that quality of surprised attention he occasionally produced. You're very direct, he said. You hired me for my steady character, she said. Directness is a component. I hired you to teach 14 children to read. And I have. Several of them are now reading above expectations. You're welcome, he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. A real laugh, full and unguarded, and it changed his face completely, stripped away all the careful architecture of a man who was managing everything, and showed her something underneath that was warm and young and lighter than she had expected. And the sight of it hit her somewhere in the center of her chest, with a force she absolutely refused to examine in any detail while on horseback in the middle of a Kansas grassland. She told him, in return, about her father. Not just that he had died, but who he had been. A former printer who had read everything he printed and formed opinions about all of it, and sat with Wilhelmina on Sunday evenings, and argued ideas with her, as an equal when she was 8 years old, which had shaped every expectation she subsequently brought to every conversation with every man in her adult life, which was part of why she had stopped talking to most of them. Most men, she said carefully, do not particularly enjoy being argued with by a woman who is not asking their permission to have a better point. I noticed that, Ezekiel said. That I argue. That you're always right, he said, with a gravity so absolute that it took her 3 full seconds to register the humor in it. And then she laughed and he smiled, and the last mile to the first family's homestead passed in a warm and easy silence that felt nothing like silence at all. The problem arrived in August in the form of a man named Douglas Fitch. Douglas Fitch was a land agent from Wichita who arrived in Caldwell on a Monday with a smile that was large and a briefcase that was full, and intentions toward both the land and the people of Caldwell that became apparent within 48 hours to everyone, except the people he was specifically trying to charm. He represented a railroad development consortium that wanted to run a spur line through the settlement territory, and the route they had surveyed would pass directly through the eastern homesteads of 4 families, including the Mackeys, and would require the acquisition of those properties at prices that Fitch described as generous, and that Ezekiel, when he read the paperwork, described in terms she had not heard him use before and which she silently noted were geologically vivid. The situation was this. The consortium had acquired, through means that Ezekiel suspected, involved the same underhanded methods that Caleb Marsh had used, a series of county land records that had been misfiled after the boundary survey of 1879. These records created a technical legal ambiguity about the eastern homestead's property claims that was sufficient, if exploited, to allow the consortium to claim eminent domain status through a sympathetic county judge in Wichita. It was the kind of hidden motive that wore the costume of progress and smelled like money, and only revealed itself to people who knew what they were looking at. Ezekiel knew what he was looking at. And Wilhelmina, who had spent 2 evenings that week reviewing the original land survey documents with him at the kitchen table in the ranch house, where he had invited her to work because the light was better and the coffee was stronger, had found the specific discrepancy in the records that proved the misfilling had been deliberate. This notation, she said, pointing to a margin mark in the 1879 survey ledger. This is not a clerical error. The original boundary marker number has been overwritten. You can still see the original ink if you hold it at an angle. Ezekiel leaned over her shoulder to look, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him and smell the combination of horses and cedar and plain soap that she had catalogued, without admitting she had catalogued it over the preceding months. "You're certain," he said. "Hold it to the lamp," she said, and he did, and in the tilted light the original notation was as clear as if it had just been written. He held the ledger for a long moment. Then he set it down with careful deliberateness. "I need to ride to Wichita," he said. "You need someone to write out the formal affidavit documenting the evidence," she said, "before you ride anywhere." He turned to look at her, and she met his eyes with the same directness she always brought to everything, and the moment stretched between them with an awareness that had nothing to do with land records or railroad consortiums, and everything to do with the fact that they had been in the same room together for 3 hours and neither of them had been paying the smallest fraction of their real attention to the documents. "Yes," he said, "I do." They drafted the affidavit together. She wrote it out in her clean, precise hand, because the clarity of the handwriting would matter when it was presented to the county recorder's office. He reviewed every sentence with the thoroughness of a man who knew that the difference between justice and its absence was often a single word chosen precisely or imprecisely. It was past 10 o'clock when they finished. The ranch house was quiet around them, the night sounds of Kansas coming softly through the windows, the distant calling of an owl, the creak of the building as the air cooled, and the steady low sound of the cattle somewhere in the dark. Ezekiel walked her back to Clara Hendricks's boarding house as he always did when she stayed late at the ranch house, which Clara had endorsed with a combination of frontier practicality about nighttime safety and knowing silence about everything else. He carried the lantern and she carried her satchel, and they walked through the dark main street of the sleeping settlement with their boots quiet on the packed earth. At the boarding house gate he stopped, as he always did, to let her in. And she stopped as she had never done before. "Ezekiel," she said. His name felt different in her mouth than it had 3 months ago. It had always been Mr. Garrison, or in her private thoughts simply him, and the shift to his given name was something she had been circling for weeks with the careful sideways approach of a person who knows that direct approach will cause whatever is being circled to bolt. He was very still in the lamplight. "Yes," he said. "When you come back from Wichita," she said, and paused, because the rest of the sentence required something from her that she was in the habit of protecting very carefully. "Yes." His voice was quiet, attentive, waiting with the complete patience of a man who understood that some things needed their own time. "I would like to have a proper conversation," she said. "Not about land records. Not about the school. A conversation about something else." The lamp cast a warm circle around them both. His expression was doing something she had not seen from him before, something unguarded and certain at the same time, as though he had been waiting for her to arrive at a door he had known about for some time. "What else would you like to talk about?" he asked, and his voice was lower and gentler than she had ever heard it. "I have not decided yet," she said truthfully. "But I expect it will involve you telling me something about yourself that you have not told me yet, and possibly me admitting something that I have been avoiding admitting." "That sounds like an equitable arrangement," he said. She went inside. She lay awake for a long time listening to the Kansas night and doing something she had not done in years, which was allowing herself to want something without immediately calculating the reasons it was inadvisable. He rode to Wichita, and he was gone 5 days, and she taught her class and ran the lending library and helped Dr. Rowe with a difficult birth in which everything went right and mother and son both came through. And she held the newborn while the doctor saw to the mother, and felt something so large and unnameable in her chest that she simply breathed through it. On the 4th evening of Ezekiel's absence, Douglas Fitch came to the schoolroom. It was after hours and she was alone, and his approach had the manner of a man who had decided that a different kind of persuasion might be effective. He was pleasant enough on the surface, handsome in the polished way of men who have spent their lives presenting surfaces, and he brought with him the implication of wealth and ease and a future that looked nothing like a raw frontier town and a single-room schoolhouse. He spoke about the consortium's plans in terms of inevitability, about how progress could not be stopped, and then in terms of personal benefit, about how a woman of her obvious intelligence and education might find opportunities in Wichita or even further east, in the company of people who could properly appreciate her qualities. Wilhelmina listened to him with the patient attention she brought to everything, and when he finished she said, "Mr. Fitch, I want to make sure I understand your proposal. You are suggesting that I might use whatever influence I have with the Garrison Land Company to discourage the filing of the affidavit regarding the falsified survey records, in exchange for personal advancement facilitated by your consortium." He blinked. He had not expected her to name it that directly. "I wouldn't put it in quite those." "I would," she said pleasantly. "And my answer is no. You should also know that the affidavit is already complete and witnessed, and Mr. Garrison carries a copy to Wichita with him, which is the specific reason that your visit to me today is 4 days too late to be useful. Good evening, Mr. Fitch." He left with considerably less smoothness than he had arrived. She locked the schoolroom door and stood in the quiet for a moment with her hands clasped together, and the very satisfying feeling of a trap being walked into by the person who had set it, rather than the person it had been intended for. Ezekiel came back on a Thursday afternoon with the legal matter settled, and a letter from the county recorder's office confirming that the eastern homestead boundaries were valid and on record and protected from further challenge. He came to the school first, which was where she was, and he had the letter in his breast pocket and the particular look of a man who has successfully gone somewhere for a reason and come back having done what he went for. She read the letter and then she looked up at him and said, "Fitch came to see me while you were gone." His expression sharpened immediately. "Did he?" "I managed the conversation satisfactorily." "What did he say?" She told him precisely and without embellishment. She watched his face move through several things in rapid sequence. Anger, the specific cold kind that he kept well contained. Relief that she had not been intimidated. And then something else, something warmer and more complicated when she got to the part about naming Fitch's implication directly to his face. "You told him you knew exactly what he was proposing," Ezekiel said. "I find that naming something removes most of its power," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Wilhelmina." "Yes." "You said when I left that you wanted to have a proper conversation when I returned. I remember saying that. Would tonight be acceptable to you?" She felt the warmth of it move through her with the same quality as the first real heat after a cold month, welcome and startling and thorough. "Tonight would be perfectly acceptable," she said. They had dinner at the ranch house, which Ezekiel cooked himself with the competent unpretentiousness of a man who had been alone long enough to learn to feed himself decently. There was beef from his own cattle and bread that he had made that morning, and a pie that he admitted, with a slight self-consciousness that she found thoroughly charming, he had purchased from Mrs. Mackey during his ride out earlier in the week specifically because he had known she was coming and had wanted there to be something she would enjoy. She sat across the table from him in the lamplight with the comfortable weight of 100 shared days between them and the specific lightness of this evening, which was different, and she thought about the word that she had been careful not to use, even inside her own carefully maintained interior library. "Tell me the thing you haven't told me yet," she said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her steadily. 6 years ago," he said, "I was engaged to a woman in St. Louis. Her name was Eleanor. She was a very good person, genuinely and completely. She came west with me once to see the land, and she hated it. Not in the way of complaining, but in the real way, the way where a person's whole self is in the wrong place. I could see it. She couldn't understand why I couldn't leave. We ended it by mutual and honest agreement, and I have felt guilty about it ever since." "Guilty about what?" Wilhelmina asked. "About staying. About being unable to leave something I'd built in order to choose a person," he said, and his voice was very careful. She understood immediately what he was not quite saying. "And you've been afraid," she said, "that the same thing would happen again. That you would want someone and the wanting would run straight up against the fact that you are, at some fundamental level, this place. And if the person does not want to be this place, then the wanting becomes a trap for both of you." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just had something named that he had been carrying for years without being able to properly hold it. "Yes," he said. "Ezekiel," she said. "I came here because flat was worse than hard. I came because this was the first thing in years that required something real from me. I came because I wanted a life with substance in it." She paused. "I am not a leaner. I am not going to come west, look at the land and hate it. I have been here for 5 months, and I have been in a river up to my shoulders, and I have drafted legal documents in lamplight, and I have watched a man I deeply respect stand in an open street and choose to speak truth to someone trying to shoot him, and I have woken up every morning since I arrived in this hard, beautiful, unreasonable place, and felt more alive than I felt in 3 years of managed, careful, flat survival in Philadelphia." The room was very quiet. "I am telling you," she said, because she had decided in the sleepless night of his absence that she was done circling the door, "that I do not want to teach school in Caldwell and live at Clara Hendricks's boarding house and ride out once a week on ranch business. I want the rest of it, and I believe you do too, and I would rather name that directly than spend another 5 months approaching it sideways." He set down his coffee cup. He got up from the table and came around it, and she turned in her chair to face him, and he stood there looking down at her with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, all the careful management and the steady control set aside, just a man looking at a woman with something in his face that was vast and certain and had been there. She understood now. Since approximately the moment she had walked out from behind a water trough and laughed in the middle of a street where someone had just been shooting. "Wilhelmina," he said, "I have been in love with you since some time in May, and I have been telling myself it was inadvisable for the same number of reasons that are currently, in this specific light, all failing to matter." She stood up. They were very close together in the lamplight with the wide Kansas night outside the window and the whole improbable fact of two people who had come to themselves from very different directions and arrived at the same place. "Then stop telling yourself that," she said. He kissed her with a thoroughness and a care that made it clear he had thought about doing it and had been determined to do it properly when the time came. And she kissed him back with everything she had not been allowing herself to want. And outside the wind moved through the grass with the particular sound of the frontier, which was not gentle but was very much alive. The courtship, once both of them had stopped pretending it wasn't happening, was rapid by the standards of the time and extremely thorough by any standard. They rode together every Saturday. He read to her from his books in the evenings, and she argued with him about Middlemark in a way that delighted him thoroughly. She taught him 2 card games that her father had taught her, and he won neither, and she was not diplomatic about this. He showed her the full extent of the Garrison ranch, acres of good Kansas grass that he had built from nothing, and explained the management of it with a passion that was entirely genuine, and she listened with an attention that matched it because she was genuinely interested, and also because the sight of him in his own element, entirely at ease and entirely himself, was something she could have watched for a long time without complaint. In September he asked her to marry him. He did it simply and directly, the way he did everything, standing in the schoolroom after the last student had gone home, with the afternoon light coming through the window and settling on the dusty floorboards, and he said, "I want you to marry me. Not because it's the practical arrangement or the expected thing, but because you are the only person I have ever met with whom I feel entirely like myself, and because every morning I wake up looking forward to whatever you are going to say next, and I think that is the definition of something worth doing properly." She had prepared several composed responses in the abstract and found, confronted with the actuality, that she had access to none of them. She said, "Yes, Ezekiel, of course I will marry you." He took her hands and looked at her with something in his face that was new and very bright, and she understood that this man, who had built a settlement and managed crises and stood in open streets without flinching, was deeply moved, and that he was allowing her to see it, which was the most significant thing he had ever given her. They were married in October by the Methodist minister who came through Caldwell on his quarterly circuit, in a ceremony attended by Clara Hendricks, who cried with a complete absence of embarrassment, and by Obadiah Crane, who showed up in person for the first time in months and shook Ezekiel's hand with grave satisfaction, and by all 14 of Wilhelmina's students, who sat in a row in the schoolroom where the ceremony was held and were remarkably well-behaved except for Tom Rourke, who cried, which he would have denied comprehensively if anyone had mentioned it. Dr. Rowe stood up for Ezekiel. Macy Thorne, the 12-year-old who had been hungry for a matching reader, stood up for Wilhelmina with a solemnity that was very touching. Wilhelmina wore a dress that Clara had helped her make from blue wool that Ezekiel had ordered from a fabric house in Kansas City, a detail she had discovered only after Clara let it slip 2 weeks before the wedding. She had confronted him about it, and he had said, with perfect equanimity, "I was informed you would need a dress, and I ascertained the correct color through independent inquiry." She had demanded to know who had informed him, and he had declined to identify the source, citing, with complete seriousness, the confidentiality of important intelligence. She had loved him so much in that moment that she had to find something immediate to do with her hands or risk embarrassing them both. The winter of 1883 was hard in the way that first winters on the frontier were always hard, which was to say it was harder than she had imagined and less hard than she had feared. The ranch house, which became her home, was better built than most frontier dwellings because Ezekiel had put genuine thought into its construction, with good chinking between the logs and a sound roof, and a fireplace that drew properly. She learned to manage the stove with efficiency that she took some pride in. She learned to read the weather coming off the western horizon 3 hours before it arrived. She learned the particular vocabulary of the cattle operation, which she required partly for practical reasons, and partly because Ezekiel talked about his ranch the way she talked about her books, with a precision and a care that she found beautiful to listen to. She continued teaching through the winter. She hired a young woman named Betsy Crane, Obadiah's daughter, as her afternoon assistant, which freed her to also begin working formally with Dr. Rowe 2 mornings per week, a development that Ezekiel endorsed completely, saying that she had been treating it as a future possibility when it was clearly a present capacity, and she ought to stop being economical with her own gifts. She thought about her father when he said things like that. She thought that he would have liked this man enormously. Spring came. The grass went green with a swiftness that still astonished her, the prairie renewing itself with a generosity that seemed to contradict the difficulty of everything else. She was pregnant by April, which she confirmed not through Dr. Rowe but through her own knowledge, and then confirmed with Dr. Rowe as a formality. And when she told Ezekiel on a Friday evening sitting at the kitchen table with the windows open to the warm air, he was still for a long moment, and then he covered her hands with both of his and looked at her with an expression of such complete and quiet joy that she felt it in every part of herself. Their son was born in December of 1884, a hard birth of 11 hours that Dr. Rowe managed with Wilhelmina's own calm assistance in the earlier stages, before she ceased being useful to anyone except the business at hand. The baby was named James, for her father, and he arrived with a full complement of opinions about the arrangement that he expressed with great volume and no particular regard for the hour. Ezekiel held his son for the first time with the careful precision of a man handling something of extraordinary value, and the expression on his face was one that Wilhelmina, despite the preceding 11 hours, made herself fully present to see, because she understood that this was one of those moments that she would need in her memory later, exact and complete. "Hello," Ezekiel said to the baby, in a conversational tone that implied he expected a response. "You're going to have strong opinions about everything, aren't you?" He glanced up at Wilhelmina. "He takes after you already." "He's 4 minutes old," she said. "He came in arguing," Ezekiel said. "That's definitively your influence." She laughed, and it turned into something that was partly crying from sheer exhaustion and relief, and he shifted the baby to one arm with practiced care that she found impressive given that he had been holding him for a total of 3 minutes, and put his other arm around her, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. James Garrison grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was an unusual and thoroughly charming combination. He was walking by 13 months and talking by 16, and his first complete sentence, delivered to the ranch foreman's border collie with great conviction, was, "That is my stick." Wilhelmina documented this in the journal she had begun keeping when she arrived in Caldwell, which had originally been a practical record of her new situation, and had become, over the months and years, a document of the life she had built here. She read it sometimes in the evenings when the house was quiet and James was asleep, and Ezekiel was at his desk with his ranch accounts, and the distance between the woman who had gotten off that train with 2 carpet bags and a set jaw, and the woman who was reading these pages in a warm house with a baby asleep down the hall and a man she loved making quiet sounds at a desk across the room, was so great that it felt like the distance between 2 different people, except that it was the same person, expanded. That was the right word for it. She had come here expecting to survive, and instead she had expanded. The lending library grew into something formal by 1885. She petitioned the county for official recognition and received it, and with Ezekiel's assistance and a donation of funds that he refused to allow her to characterize as anything other than a community investment, they converted a storage room adjacent to the schoolroom into Caldwell's first public library. The opening was attended by everyone in the settlement and by several people from neighboring homesteads who had heard about it through the particular telegraph of frontier communities, which was faster and more comprehensive than any actual wire. Betsy Crane took over the schoolroom full-time in the spring of 1886 because Wilhelmina had passed her teacher's examination with the county board and moved on to formal medical training under Dr. Rowe, who had been formally petitioning for a second physician in Caldwell for 2 years by then, and was not inclined to waste a resource he had spent 3 years developing. Ezekiel said, when she told him she would be qualifying as a physician within the year, "I knew that when I hired you." "You hired me to teach school," she said. "I hired you because your letter was the most clearly reasoned document I had ever received from anyone, and it seemed reasonable to assume that a person who wrote like that was not going to stop at the first thing they were hired to do." She gave him a look. "You could have said that 3 years ago. I was waiting for you to arrive at it yourself," he said, with perfect equanimity. "You have a fundamental preference for coming to conclusions under your own power, which I respect entirely." She pointed at him. "That is extremely presumptuous." "Absolutely," he agreed. "Was I wrong?" She did not answer that, which was its own answer, and he grinned with the full warmth that he still reserved primarily for her and for James, and that she still found, years in, capable of completely undoing her careful composure. Their daughter arrived in 1886, in early autumn when the heat had broken and the prairie grass was going gold. She was easier to birth than James had been, arriving in 5 hours with the purposeful efficiency that would characterize her entire personality, and she was named Clara Ruth, for Clara Hendricks, and for Ezekiel's sister Ruth, both of whom were present at the birth, Ruth having finally succeeded in her campaign to visit her brother after years of determined correspondence, and having arrived 3 weeks earlier in time to be charmed by James, who had welcomed her with a formal handshake and an offer to show her his best stick. Clara Hendricks, for whom the baby was named, received this honor with the unself-conscious emotion of a woman who had become the closest thing to family that either of them had in Caldwell, and who had earned it completely. Ruth Garrison, who was 28 and had her brother's eyes and a great deal more spontaneous warmth than he had ever managed to display before Wilhelmina arrived, sat across from Wilhelmina while the baby slept between them and said, "You know, he wrote to me about you before he had been in the same room with you for a week." Wilhelmina looked up. "What did he write?" He said the new schoolteacher had arrived and that she was, and I am quoting him directly because I memorized it, formidably intelligent, disconcertingly direct, and completely unimpressed by anything except ideas and honest effort, which means she is going to be very difficult to ignore. Wilhelmina thought about that for a long moment. He said that in the first week. He said it, Ruth confirmed, as though it were a problem he was reporting. But the way he wrote it was not the way of a man describing a problem. Wilhelmina looked down at the sleeping baby with a feeling that was so full it needed all of her to contain it. He is very stubborn about pretending things are practical when they are actually something else, she said. 20 years of watching him, Ruth said agreeably. I know. The winter of 1886 was milder than the two preceding it, and the settlement continued to grow. 3 new families arrived before Christmas. A general store larger than the existing mercantile was built on the south end of Garrison Avenue. Ezekiel sold the eastern parcels of the ranch land to 2 homesteading families at prices that reflected actual value rather than opportunity, a policy that Clara Hendricks endorsed loudly in her capacity as an informal community conscience. And that made him something in the settlement that he was uncomfortable accepting credit for, which was genuinely loved. He was elected to the county board in the spring of 1887, which he accepted with the same equanimity he brought to everything, while privately telling Wilhelmina that he found the political dimensions of the role exactly as tedious as he had expected, and that the only reason he had agreed was that the alternative candidate had been Douglas Fitch, who had returned to Caldwell in 1885 in the employ of a different consortium, and continued to be the kind of man who required a counterweight. Fitch departed Caldwell for the final time in the autumn of 1887, when his second attempt to challenge the eastern homestead boundaries was defeated by documentation that was partly the result of the affidavit that Wilhelmina had drafted in 1883, and partly the result of the county land records that she had reorganized and indexed during her work with the county board in her capacity as the settlement's physician, a role that gave her access to official records and a forensic attention that turned out to be extremely useful. Dr. Rowe, who had been increasingly leaning toward retirement, told Ezekiel at a county meeting that his wife was going to be the finest physician in the territory within the decade, and that Ezekiel was a lucky man. Ezekiel agreed completely and without irony, which made Rowe laugh. Wilhelmina heard about this exchange secondhand from Clara Hendricks and noted it in her journal that evening, with a footnote confirming that luck was not exactly the right word for what either of them had, but that she understood what Rowe meant and found it difficult to argue with. In 1888, she received her formal certification as a physician from the Kansas State Board of Medical Examiners, which had only recently begun accepting female candidates following a sustained campaign by several women's medical colleges. She was the first licensed female physician in Caldwell County and one of fewer than 20 in the state of Kansas. The certification arrived in a letter that she opened at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while James, who was 3, was eating porridge and demonstrating his most recent linguistic discovery, which was the word actually, deployed with maximum frequency. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down carefully on the table. Ezekiel came in from the morning ranch work and poured himself coffee and looked at her and at the letter and at her again. She pushed the letter across the table. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her with the expression that was the one she loved most from him, the one that had no performance in it, the full and simple weight of what he felt showing plainly on a face that had learned to show it to her without reservation. Dr. Ezekiel Garrison, he said, because they had decided when they married that she would keep Easton as part of her professional name, a decision that had caused mild confusion in certain quarters of the county, and that she and Ezekiel had both found entirely satisfying. That is what the letter says, she agreed. He came around the table and kissed her with a warmth that made James say, "Actually, you are kissing with great interest, and they both laughed, and the morning went on in its ordinary, irreplaceable way. By 1889, the school had 30 students and 2 full-time teachers. The library had 400 volumes and a regular lending membership of 60 families. Wilhelmina's medical practice had expanded to cover 3 neighboring settlements, requiring 2 days of travel per week that she and Ezekiel managed with careful coordination, and the assistance of a young woman named Hannah Briggs, sister of Deputy Harlan Briggs, who served as housekeeper and occasional child watcher with the competence of someone who had grown up in a frontier family and considered no task too complicated or beneath her. James was 4 and serious and curious about everything. Clara Ruth was 3 and had her father's patience and her mother's complete absence of interest in being managed, which combination was already producing results in the schoolroom that Betsy Crane described as both promising and occasionally alarming. The ranch prospered in the way of ranches managed by people who understood both cattle and people, which was the particular double competence that Ezekiel had always had. He had hired 2 additional ranch hands by 1888, both of whom he had selected with the same careful directness he brought to all personnel decisions, and the operation had expanded its cattle stock and its eastern pasture acreage, without losing the quality of management that distinguished it from the larger but sloppier ranches to the north. He was still the man who stood in open streets and spoke plainly to desperate people. He was still the man who kept basic hardware in a canvas bag, because frontier buildings needed it. He was still the man who had driven 2 women to a lending library gathering, and had discussed Middlemark with a precision and passion that had told her more about him than 6 weeks of businesslike Friday conversations. He was still all of those things, and he was also a husband and a father and a county board member and the person who made coffee before she was awake every morning and left it on the stove because he knew she needed it before she was ready to face the day. A small and complete act of love that she noted every single morning and never let herself take for granted. She found him one evening in October of 1889, sitting on the front porch of the ranch house with James asleep in his arms, and Clara Ruth on the step beside him looking at the stars, which she had recently become interested in since Wilhelmina had shown her how to find the North Star. The sky was enormous above them with the full depth of a clear autumn night, and the grass whispered in the light wind, and the cattle were somewhere quiet and dark in the pasture, and the lights of Caldwell were visible in the distance, the lantern glow of a settlement that had grown into something real. Wilhelmina sat down beside him on the porch with the particular bone-deep tiredness of a day that had been full and good, and she leaned against his shoulder and felt him shift to accommodate her without waking James. "Which one?" Clara Ruth demanded, pointing at the sky. "The one that doesn't move," Wilhelmina said. "Look for the dipper shape first, find the 2 stars at the far end of the cup, draw a line through them and follow it to the bright one that sits still while everything else turns." Clara Ruth stared upward with the focused intensity she brought to every inquiry. "Found it," she announced. "Good," Ezekiel said. "How does it know to stay still?" "It doesn't know," Wilhelmina said. "It just happens to be nearly at the point the Earth's axis points toward, so when we turn, it appears not to move." Clara Ruth processed this. "So we're the ones moving," she said. "Yes," Wilhelmina said. Said Clara Ruth, and turned back to the sky with an expression of philosophical satisfaction. Ezekiel's hand found Wilhelmina's in the dark without looking, and she turned her palm up to take his, and they sat on the porch of a house they had made into a home with the 2 small people they had made into a family, and the wide Kansas night open above them. And she thought about the letter she had written at a kitchen table in Philadelphia in the winter of 1882, the careful, reasoned, practical letter to an address in a frontier town she had never been to. And the life that letter had been the first step toward. She had come expecting hardship. She had found it in generous and various measure, the kind that tested everything she had and asked for more and then asked again. But she had also found this, the exact texture of this ordinary evening, which was so unreasonably full of everything she had been trying not to want that she could not hold it at arm's length and examine it, and she had stopped trying to. She had found a man who woke up every day looking forward to what she would say next, and who had told her so, and who had proven it by being present for every word she had said since. She had found students who were learning to read the stars and the land and the books and the world. She had found a purpose that was so large it had taken her years to fully step into it, and she was still stepping. She had found in the hard and beautiful unreasonable place she had chosen the specific life that was shaped like her, and had been waiting, in its pragmatic frontier way, for her to arrive and claim it. "What are you thinking?" Ezekiel asked in the quiet voice he kept for evenings. She looked at the star her daughter was still watching with a 4-year-old's ferocious concentration, at the sleeping weight of her son in his father's arms, at the lights of Caldwell warm against the dark horizon. "That I was right," she said. "About what?" "About flat being worse than hard," she said, "and that I had no idea when I said it how completely correct I was." He was quiet for a moment. She felt the movement of his breathing, slow and steady, the most familiar rhythm in her world. "I think about the day you got off the train," he said, "and what it would have meant if you hadn't. For the school. For me," he said simply, and the two words were so complete and so uncomplicated that she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder with the force of everything she felt and could not say any better than he just had. Clara Ruth, who was 4 years old and paying no attention to her parents, said, "The star doesn't care about anything." "No," Wilhelmina said, lifting her head, "it doesn't. But we know where it is anyway." "Yes." "So we care for it," Clara Ruth said, with the simple certitude of a child arriving at philosophy through direct observation. "Yes," Ezekiel said, and there was a smile in his voice that she could hear without seeing his face. "I suppose we do." The night went on around them, large and patient and full of the sounds of a living place. James stirred in his father's arms and did not wake. Clara Ruth found a second star she liked and asked for its name. Wilhelmina gave her the name and the distance, and Clara Ruth added it to her sky inventory with the thoroughness she had from both her parents. Inside the ranch house, the stove was banked against the night cold, and there were books on the shelf that had been read and discussed and argued over, and there were children's boots by the door in 2 different small sizes, and there was a medical bag by the kitchen table that would go out again in 2 days on the settlement route, and there were letters on the desk, one from Ruth in Missouri saying she planned to visit in the spring and bringing all 3 of her children this time, and one from Clara Hendricks, who was only across the street and yet wrote letters because she said she had things to express that required the precision of the written word. There were land records filed correctly and legally in the county office. Protecting the homes of families who did not know her name was on the affidavit that had protected them. There were 30 children in the Caldwell school who could read. There was a library with 400 books in it. There was a medical certification in the name of Wilhelmina Easton Garrison, framed on the wall of the room she used as a consulting office, which James referred to as his mother's important paper, and had once attempted to improve with a crayon before being intercepted. And there was this, a porch and a night, and a man whose hand was warm around hers, and 2 children discovering the permanence of stars, and the wide Kansas dark that was not gentle but was very much alive, and Wilhelmina Easton, who had come to the frontier expecting hardship, and had found every hard day was the kind that was absolutely, unquestionably, irreversibly worth waking for. The North Star held its place above them while everything else turned, patient and certain, and exactly where it was supposed to be. They stayed on the porch until the night deepened and the children's eyes grew heavy, and then Ezekiel carried James inside while Wilhelmina took Clara Ruth by the hand and led her through the door that Ezekiel had once rehinged in 20 minutes with a hammer and spare hardware, and she tucked her daughter into her bed and listened to the child's breathing go slow and even, and she stood in the dark hallway of her home for a moment with her hand on the doorframe, and let the fullness of it be exactly what it was. Ezekiel found her there. He put his hands on her shoulders from behind, and she put her hands over his. "Come to bed," he said softly. "In a moment," she said. "I'm just—" "I know," he said. She turned to look at him in the dim light that came from the sitting room. He was looking at her with the expression that had no performance in it, warm and complete and entirely without reservation. The face of a man who had decided a long time ago that she was worth every adaptation his life had ever required, and had never once needed to revise that decision. She reached up and touched his face, and he turned slightly into her hand the way he always did, a small involuntary motion that she loved with a specificity she could not have put into words. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For the letter that said the frontier will test every assumption. For the coffee that was always on the stove. For standing in an open street and speaking the truth to someone who needed to hear it. For being exactly what you are." He covered her hand with his. "Thank you," he said, "for the letter that was the most clearly reasoned document I had ever received. For laughing in a street where someone was shooting. For drafting the affidavit. For going into the river. For staying." She took a breath. "I was never going to leave," she said. "I know," he said. "But there's a difference between staying because you have to and staying because it is entirely, unreservedly where you want to be. The second one is what you gave me, and I know the weight of it." The house was quiet around them. The prairie turned slowly under the stars. The North Star held its place. She took his hand and they walked down the hallway to their room, and the door closed softly behind them. And outside in the Kansas night the grass went on being what it had always been, enormous and patient and full of a life that was hard and irreplaceable in equal and indivisible measure. This was the frontier, and this was the life she had come for, and it was everything she had not known she was looking for and nothing she would ever surrender. And every morning when she woke to the smell of coffee already on the stove and the sounds of a house full of small voices and the wide, ungovernable sky out every window, she understood that she had not been saved from hardship. She had been met in the middle of it by someone willing to stand beside her in the open, and that had made all the difference that could ever matter. It had made every hard day worth waking for.